The alarm clock did not ring. I woke up 5 minutes before it could, reaching out in the dark to press the button. Silence is a fragile thing in a small apartment. I swung my legs over the side of the mattress and let my feet hit the cold linoleum. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I stood up. I walked to the kitchen and turned on the tap. The pipes groaned. I splashed water on my face, letting the chill wake me up. The mirror over the sink reflected a man who looked older than his years. The lines around my eyes held stories I preferred not to tell. I dried my face with a rough towel and reached for the coffee tin. There were exactly 3 scoops of grounds left, just enough for 1 strong cup to get me through the morning. I set the pot to brew and walked down the short hallway. The door to his room was open a crack. I pushed it with my knuckles. Leo was tangled in his blankets. His small chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. A plastic dinosaur rested on the pillow next to his ear. I stood there watching him breathe. This is the only thing that matters. I walked back to the kitchen and poured the black liquid into a chipped mug. The kitchen table was buried under a pile of envelopes. Most of them had red text printed on the front. Past due. Final notice. I took a sip of the bitter coffee. The heat burned my throat, but it grounded me. Today was the day. It had to be. I walked to the closet and pulled out the suit. It was 10 years old, bought for a wedding that felt like a lifetime ago. The fabric was stiff. The shoulders were tight, the cuffs frayed. I put on the white shirt. The collar dug into my neck. I tied the necktie, watching my hands in the mirror. They were calloused, stained with grease, and late nights spent ripping apart motherboards and soldering circuits. Not the hands of a corporate man, the hands of a survivor. I pulled the jacket over my shoulders. It felt like armor. Cheap armor, but armor nonetheless. I drank the rest of the coffee in 1 gulp. I grabbed my keys from the hook by the door. I left a note on the table for Mrs. Gable next door. She was coming over to walk Leo to school. The air outside was thick with the morning damp. The streetlights flickered against the gray sky. My truck sat by the curb. It was a rusted relic that somehow still started every morning. I climbed in and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and caught with a deep roar. I merged onto the highway as the sun began to break over the skyline. The city looked different in the early light. It looked less forgiving. Endless rows of concrete and glass stretched out before me. Somewhere in that maze was a desk with my name on it. Or at least I hoped there was. The heater in the truck was broken. I kept the window cracked to keep the windshield from fogging up. The cold wind bit at my face. I gripped the steering wheel tight. My knuckles turned white under the street lamps. I rehearsed the interview questions in my head. I knew the tech. I knew the systems better than the men who designed them. I spent years fixing their mistakes from a cramped desk in a basement server room. But I didn't have the paper. I didn't have the pedigree. The silence in the cab felt heavy. It was the weight of a Monday, the weight of a turning point. I watched the fuel gauge hover near empty. Every drop counted today. I remembered the days before everything went sideways. I remembered the steady paycheck from the repair shop down on 5th Street. It kept the lights on. Then the corporate chains moved in. They didn't fix things anymore. They threw them away and sold you a new one. I wasn't built for a throwaway world. I believed in taking things apart, finding the broken piece and making it whole again. I had spent the last 2 years doing freelance coding late at night. I patched servers for small businesses while Leo slept. It was exhausting. I pulled out my worn leather portfolio. Inside was my resume, 2 pages of plain text. No fancy university logos. No internships at glass towers. Just raw experience. 10,000 hours of untangling spaghetti code and reviving dead mainframes. I hoped it would be enough. I needed it to be enough. The traffic thickened as I neared the city center. Suits and sleek black cars stared straight ahead, lost in their own worlds. I was a ghost in a machine, a guy in an old Ford hoping to bluff his way into the kingdom. Every red light was a test of patience. The truck rattled over potholes. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to quiet the noise in my head. The doubts crept in. What was I thinking? A guy like me walking into a billion-dollar tech firm. They built empires on shiny presentations and buzzwords. I built my life on duct tape and sheer will, but I had seen their job listing. They needed a senior systems architect. They needed someone who understood the bare metal, not just the theory. I knew I could do the job. I just had to make them see it. I found a parking spot 3 blocks from the address. The meter swallowed my last few quarters. I stepped out of the truck and looked up. The building was a monolith of dark glass. It scraped the clouds, casting a long shadow over the street. I pulled down the sleeves of my jacket to hide the frayed cuffs. I took a deep breath. The cold air filled my lungs. I thought of Leo sleeping in his bed. I thought of the red envelopes on the table. There was no backup plan. There was no safety net. I put one foot in front of the other. I walked toward the glass doors. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss. The temperature dropped 10 degrees the second I crossed the threshold. The lobby was a vast expanse of white marble and brushed steel. It felt more like a hospital than an office. Everything was spotless. Everything was angled sharp and unforgiving. My boots scuffed against the polished floor. The sound echoed loud in the cavernous room. A few heads turned in my direction. Men in tailored suits, women in sharp blazers holding sleek tablets. They looked right through me. I walked to the reception desk. A massive slab of dark wood curved around a woman wearing a headset. She didn't look up from her screen. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock interview," I said. My voice sounded too rough, too loud for this place. She raised a single manicured finger. She finished typing a message before turning her eyes to me. They were cold, calculating. "Name?" she asked. The word was flat. "David," I replied. "David Vance, Systems Architecture." She typed something into her console. A small frown creased her forehead. "Take elevator B to the 42nd floor. Wait in the atrium." She handed me a temporary badge printed on a thin piece of plastic. It had a barcode and the word visitor in bold red letters. I clipped it to my lapel. It felt like a warning label. I walked toward the bank of elevators. The chrome doors reflected my distorted image. The cheap suit, the tired eyes, the hands that didn't belong here. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. I stepped inside. There were no buttons, just a glass screen displaying my destination. The ascent was silent and fast. My stomach dropped as the floor numbers ticked higher on the digital display. The higher you go, the thinner the air gets. The doors opened to a different world. The 42nd floor was an open-plan maze of glass walls and glowing monitors. Low murmurs and the clicking of keyboards formed a steady hum. It was a hive. Everyone moved with quiet purpose. I walked toward a seating area near a large corner window. The chairs were leather minimalist and uncomfortable. I sat down on the edge of the cushion. I kept my worn portfolio resting on my knees. I looked out the window. The city looked like a circuit board from up here, a complex network of roads and power grids moving data and people from one node to another. I understood networks. I understood how a single loose connection could bring down the whole system. That was my element. But the people in this room didn't care about the wires. They cared about the interface. They cared about how the machine looked, not how it bled. A guy walked past me carrying a tray of iced coffees. He wore a gray hoodie and sneakers that probably cost more than my truck. He gave me a brief puzzled glance. I was a stray dog wandering into a pedigree show. I kept my eyes focused on the floor. I focused on my breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The waiting is always the hardest part. It gives your mind time to wander, time to calculate the odds. And the odds were stacked high. I noticed the server room down the hall. Behind thick glass doors, rows of black racks stood like silent sentinels. The blinking blue and green lights pulsed in a steady rhythm. I could almost hear the hum of the cooling units from where I sat. That was the heart of the beast. That was where the real work happened. I watched a technician in a white coat scan his badge and enter the room. He walked with a casual stroll. He didn't respect the machines. You have to respect the hardware. It remembers your mistakes. It waits for the worst possible moment to remind you. I rubbed my thumb over the edge of my portfolio. Inside was the sum of my professional life. It felt light. Too light for a place like this. These walls were built on degrees from schools I couldn't afford to drive past. They measured worth in titles and stock options. I measured it in uptime, in catching the glitch before the servers crashed, in keeping the lights on when everyone else went home. 40 minutes passed. The clock on the wall mocked me. Every tick was a reminder of the time I was wasting. Time I could be spending fixing a burnt-out motherboard for a quick $50. Time I could be spending with Leo. But I stayed seated. I needed the stability. I needed the medical benefits. I needed to know that if the roof leaked, I wouldn't have to choose between fixing it and buying groceries. A door opened at the far end of the hall. A man stepped out. He wore a dark blue suit that fit like a second skin. His hair was perfectly styled. His watch caught the glare of the overhead lights. He held a tablet in one hand. He looked down at the screen, then looked up at me. His gaze was sharp, dissecting. He didn't smile. "David Vance," he called out. The voice carried across the open room. It was the voice of a man used to giving orders. I stood up. I gripped the leather portfolio. I nodded. "Follow me," he said. He turned and walked back into the room without waiting to see if I followed. I took a breath. I adjusted my frayed collar. I walked toward the door. The door closed behind me with a heavy thud. The office was vast-lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a concrete empire. A mahogany desk sat in the center like an altar. The man in the blue suit walked around it and sat down. He didn't offer me a chair. He tapped the screen of his tablet and leaned back. "I am Marcus Vance, CEO," he said, not looking up. "Though we share a last name, I doubt we share much else. Your file is unusual." I stood there holding my leather portfolio. My boots felt out of place on the plush carpet. "I have 15 years of hands-on architecture experience," I said. Marcus swiped his finger across the glass. A faint smirk touched the corners of his mouth. "Freelance repairs, basement server maintenance for strip malls, a community college stint you didn't finish." He tossed the tablet onto the desk. The sharp clack of glass against wood filled the room. "We build the future here, David. We don't patch up the past." I kept my posture straight. My jaw tightened, but I kept my voice level. "Code is code. Hardware is hardware. A server failing in a strip mall crashes the same way a mainframe does in a glass tower." Marcus let out a short, dry laugh. He steepled his fingers, resting his chin on them. "A romantic notion, but a false one. You see, my engineers come from elite institutions. They understand theory, scale, and elegance. You understand duct tape." The words hit like a physical blow. They were meant to. It was the arrogance of a man who had never rebuilt a burnt-out motherboard to pay for his kid's asthma medication. "I understand how systems break under pressure," I replied. "Theory looks great on a whiteboard. But when the servers overheat at 3 a.m, elegance doesn't keep the data safe." Marcus stood up and walked to the window. He looked down at the street below. He looked like a king surveying a kingdom he bought, not built. "We don't experience 3 a.m. failures. Our architecture is resilient. We need visionaries, not mechanics." He turned back to face me. The amusement was gone from his eyes. Only cold dismissal remained. "You don't belong in this building, David. Your resume made it to my desk due to a filtering error in HR. An error I will be correcting." I looked at the tablet sitting on his desk. My life, my late nights, my raw, calloused hands reduced to a software glitch. It was a bitter pill to swallow. "A man's worth isn't printed on a diploma," I said. The words tasted like ash. I knew they wouldn't land, but I had to say them. Marcus buttoned his suit jacket. He checked his heavy silver watch. The meeting was over before it even began. "This company is a machine, a high-performance engine," he said. "You don't put cheap oil in a race car. Thank you for your time." He didn't hold out his hand. He didn't even look at me as he spoke. He just stared at the door, waiting for me to walk through it. I gripped the handle of my portfolio. The frayed leather dug into my palm. I thought about the red envelopes waiting on my kitchen table. I thought about Leo's worn-out sneakers. The anger flared in my chest, hot and heavy. But anger doesn't pay the rent. I gave a slow nod. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. I turned around and walked toward the exit. "One piece of advice," Marcus called out just as I reached the handle. I stopped, but didn't look back. "Stick to your lane. The world needs people to fix the printers. Just don't confuse yourself with the people who invent them." I pushed the heavy oak door open. The hum of the open-plan office hit me like a wave of static. The bright lights felt blinding after the dim, cool air of the CEO's office. I walked back down the long corridor. The same glass walls, the same glowing monitors, the people in their sharp clothes typing away oblivious to the man walking past them. I was a ghost again, a mechanic trespassing in the temple. My chest felt hollow. The morning coffee had turned to acid in my stomach. I just wanted to get back to my truck. I wanted to hear the roar of the rusted engine. I wanted to feel the grease on my hands. I wanted to be somewhere I made sense. I stared at my reflection in the elevator doors at the end of the hall. The tired eyes stared back older than they were an hour ago. The cheap suit felt heavier now, like a wet blanket dragging me down. Every step away from that mahogany desk was a step back into the grind. Back to the late-night freelance gigs that barely covered the light bill. Back to the anxiety that gnawed at my stomach every time I looked at my bank account. I remembered a night last winter. The heat had been shut off in our building. I had wrapped Leo in 3 blankets and stayed up until dawn coding a database for a local trucking company just to get the gas turned back on. Marcus Vance didn't know cold. He knew climate control. He knew the world as a spreadsheet where guys like me were just a rounding error. The elevator arrived with a soft melodic chime. The doors slid apart. I stepped inside the empty glass box. I turned around to face the floor one last time. Through the open doorway of the server room down the hall, I saw the technician in the white coat. He was holding a cup of coffee near a primary cooling vent, laughing at something on his phone. I shook my head. Careless. The doors began to close, cutting off my view of the glass tower. The descent was fast, making my ears pop. I leaned against the back wall and closed my eyes. The adrenaline of the morning was draining away, leaving a dull ache in my temples. How was I going to explain this to Mrs. Gable? She always looked at me with that quiet pity. The single dad trying to make it work, always falling just a little bit short. How was I going to look at Leo tonight? He thought his dad could fix anything. He didn't know some things were rigged to stay broken. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened to the vast expanse of white marble. The temperature was still freezing. I walked past the reception desk. The woman with the headset didn't even glance in my direction. My temporary badge was still clipped to my lapel. I ripped the plastic off my jacket and tossed it into a silver trash can. It clattered against the bottom, a fitting end to a useless morning. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped out onto the street. The gray sky had broken open, spitting a cold, fine mist onto the pavement. The city noise washed over me. Sirens wailed in the distance. Taxis honked in the gridlock. It was harsh, but it was honest. I pulled my collar up against the wind. I started the 3-block walk back to my rusted Ford. I had a busted laptop waiting on my workbench at home. It needed a new motherboard and a clean install. It would pay $50. It was a start. I made it 1 block before I patted my coat pocket. It was flat. I stopped on the wet sidewalk. I checked my pants. Nothing. My truck keys were sitting in the plastic tray at the front desk security scanner. I closed my eyes. I let the cold mist hit my face. It was just one more joke in a morning full of them. I turned around and started walking back. The glass tower loomed ahead. It looked darker now against the storm clouds. I pushed through the revolving doors for the second time. The white marble lobby was no longer silent. The ambient hum had shifted into a frantic buzz. The receptionist was standing. Her headset was thrown on the desk. She was shouting at a man in a gray security uniform. The calm, calculated facade of the building was gone. I walked toward the scanner to grab my keys. The massive digital screens lining the walls flickered. The corporate logos vanished. They were replaced by lines of raw data scrolling at a dizzying speed. Then the screens flashed red. A low, rhythmic siren began to wail. It wasn't a fire alarm. It was a system-wide hardware alert. I knew that sound. It was the sound of a mainframe suffocating. I reached the desk and saw my keys in the tray. I grabbed them. I should have walked away. My job was done here. The rusted Ford was waiting. But I looked at the scrolling text on the wall screens. It was a cascade failure. The core servers were overheating. They were dropping offline one by one. The data was routing into bottlenecks, causing more heat, more failure. A death loop. I heard a radio crackle on the security guard's hip. The voice on the other end was panicked. "Floor 42, cooling unit offline. We have smoke in the primary server room." The guard scrambled for his emergency keys. He ran toward the express elevator bank. He jammed a red key into the panel. The doors slid open. I didn't think about Marcus Vance. I didn't think about the cold rejection. I thought about the machines. They were dying. I followed the guard and stepped into the elevator just as the doors began to close. The guard looked at me, his eyes wide. "Sir, you need to evacuate the building." "I'm a systems architect," I said. My voice was calm, cutting through the wailing siren. "Take me up." He didn't argue. He didn't have time to. The elevator shot upward. The digital floor indicator climbed. It flashed red with every passing number. My stomach tightened. I knew what was waiting for us. I could smell it entering the ventilation shafts of the elevator. Ozone, melting plastic, burnt silicon. It was the scent of millions of dollars turning into scrap metal. The doors wrenched open on the 42nd floor. The scene was pure chaos. The pristine glass maze was a war zone. The overhead lights were out. The emergency backups bathed the floor in a harsh amber glow. People were running. The elite engineers were clustered around their sleek monitors. The screens were frozen. They were typing frantically, but the keyboards were dead. You can't code your way out of a hardware fire. You can't write a script to fix a melted motherboard. They didn't understand that. I walked down the hall. The air grew thicker with every step. The ambient heat was oppressive. I saw the server room at the end of the corridor. The thick glass doors were sealed shut. Inside, the blinking blue and green lights had turned a solid angry red. A thin wisp of black smoke seeped from the bottom of the doorframe. I saw the technician in the white coat. He was standing outside the glass, his hands pressed against his head. He dropped his coffee cup. It shattered on the floor. A dark puddle spread across the carpet. He was paralyzed. They all were. I saw Marcus Vance emerge from his mahogany office. His suit jacket was off. His tie was loosened. The sharp dissecting gaze was gone, replaced by raw fear. He stared at the server room. The heart of his empire was stopping. The high-performance engine was tearing itself apart. "The override code isn't working," an engineer shouted. He was gripping a tablet, his knuckles white. "The system is locking us out. It's a hard physical fault." "Cut the power," Marcus barked. His voice cracked. It sounded small in the echoing hall. "We can't," another voice yelled back. "The backup generators kicked in. The manual kill switches are inside the room. If we force those doors open, the sudden rush of oxygen will ignite the smoldering racks. The whole floor will go up." They were trapped in their own design. They had built a fortress to keep the world out. Now they couldn't get in to save it. The heat radiating from the glass was intense. I stood at the edge of the crowd. I watched the men in tailored suits panic. They were watching their stock options vanish. They were watching their life's work turn to toxic smoke. The automated fire suppression system was supposed to handle this, but I knew what happened. I remembered the careless technician with the coffee. He had been standing by the primary floor grate. A spill into the ventilation, a short circuit in the cooling loop. The sensors went blind. The system thought it was a cyber attack, so it engaged the physical lockdown protocol. It was a flawless software design, until it met human error. Now they were locked out of their own burning house. I looked at my hands, the heavy calluses, the grease stains that never quite washed off. These hands didn't belong here. Marcus had made that clear 10 minutes ago. I was just a mechanic. A guy who patched up the past. But right now, a mechanic was the only thing they needed. I stepped forward. I pushed past a man in a gray hoodie. I walked past the shattered coffee cup. I ignored the shouts from the engineers. I stopped in front of the thick glass doors. The heat pressed against my face. It felt familiar. It felt like the basement server rooms. It felt like work. I placed my bare hand on the hot glass. The vibrations told me everything I needed to know. The main drive was still spinning, fighting for its life. I turned my head. Marcus Vance was staring at me. He recognized the cheap suit. He recognized the frayed collar of my shirt. "What are you doing?" he yelled. "Get away from there." I didn't answer him. I looked at the electronic keypad next to the door. The screen was dead shorted out by the intense heat behind the wall. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out my keys. Attached to the ring was a heavy piece of steel, my multi-tool, worn smooth at the edges from years of use. I unfolded the pliers. The room went dead silent behind me. Only the wail of the siren remained. The heavy hum of the dying servers rattled my teeth. I jammed the tip of the pliers into the seam of the keypad casing. I applied pressure. The plastic cracked. This wasn't a problem for a visionary. This was a problem for a guy with a toolbox. And my shift was just starting. The casing of the keypad snapped off with a sharp crack. It echoed over the wailing siren in the hallway. The wires inside were a tangled mess of red, blue, and green. A man in a tailored suit grabbed my shoulder. His grip was frantic, trying to pull me away from the wall. "You can't do that. You'll trigger a secondary lockdown." I didn't turn around. I just shoved his hand away with a hard thrust of my shoulder. I kept my eyes focused on the exposed circuit board. "The system is already dying," I said. "Do you want to save your data or your plastic panel?" I used the wire cutters on my multi-tool to snip the primary power lead. A small spark jumped against the cold metal. The magnetic lock on the heavy glass doors let out a dull click. They weren't sealed anymore. But opening them was the real test. A sudden rush of oxygen into a superheated room could cause a flash fire. I pushed the heavy door open just an inch. I held my breath. I let the pressure equalize, allowing the ambient air to mix slowly with the toxic heat inside. Thick black smoke hissed through the narrow gap. It smelled like burnt plastic and fried copper. It was the scent of a machine bleeding out. Marcus Vance was shouting something behind me. His voice was lost in the roar of the dying servers. I ignored him and slipped through the gap, pulling the heavy door shut behind my back. The heat hit me like a physical blow. It squeezed the cold air right out of my lungs. My eyes watered instantly from the acrid smoke filling the enclosed space. The noise was deafening. Row after row of black steel racks vibrated violently against the floorboards. The cooling fans were screaming, trying to pull cold air that didn't exist. The indicator lights were a sea of angry red. I walked down the narrow aisle between the massive mainframes. The temperature climbed higher with every step I took. My cheap suit felt like it was baking onto my skin. Sweat stung my eyes, blurring my vision. I wiped my face with the back of my grease-stained hand. I reached the primary cooling vent where I had seen the technician standing earlier. The grated floor was slick with a dark liquid. Coffee. It had seeped through the metal mesh and dripped directly onto the environmental control unit. The circuit board was charred black. It had shorted out the cooling loop and sent a false positive to the security grid. The system thought a hostile entity was trying to fry it from the outside. So, it locked the doors, shut down the external vents, and trapped the heat inside to protect the data cores. It was a flawless piece of theoretical code. It was also lethal in the real world. The machine was suffocating itself to save its own memory. I dropped to my knees on the hard, grated floor. The metal burned through the thin fabric of my trousers. I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket and gripped it tight between my teeth. The pale beam cut through the thick, swirling smoke. I needed to bypass the charred control board. I had to hotwire the primary cooling circuit and force a manual override of the vents. I unfolded the knife blade on my multi-tool. My hands were steady. There was no fear, only the raw, familiar focus of a job that needed doing. This was my element. I sliced through the thick rubber casing of the main power bundle. The blade caught on the woven shielding underneath. I forced it through, exposing a thick copper wire. I needed a jumper to bridge the connection to the emergency fan relay. I looked around the pristine floor. There were no spare parts, no loose wires left lying around by careless technicians. They built this room to look clean, not to be functional in a crisis. I reached up to my neck. I grabbed the cheap metal tie clip holding my frayed collar together. Leo had picked it out at a thrift store for my birthday. It was just plated brass, but right now, it was the most valuable tool in the building. I snapped it in half. I used my pliers to bend the jagged metal into a crude U-shape. It wasn't elegant, and no university professor would ever endorse it, but it conducted electricity. I pressed one end of the broken tie clip against the exposed copper wire. Blue sparks showered over my knuckles, biting into my skin like angry hornets. I didn't flinch. I thought about the stack of red envelopes sitting on my kitchen table. I thought about the winter nights spent shivering in a cold apartment. I gritted my teeth and pushed the other end into the relay terminal. A harsh jolt of current shot up my arm. It felt like a heavy punch to the chest. My muscles clamped down hard, but I held the connection steady. The metal clip grew burning hot against my calloused fingers. For a long, agonizing second, nothing happened. The servers continued their violent death rattle. The heat pressed down on my shoulders like a heavy lead blanket. Then deep within the floor, a heavy mechanical thud echoed through the room. The external vents slammed open. A massive rush of cold, filtered air flooded the narrow aisle. The large overhead cooling turbines roared to life. They sounded like jet engines spooling up on a runway. The thick smoke began to clear, pulled upward into the exhaust shafts. I stayed on my knees, keeping the piece of metal pinned against the terminal. The ambient temperature dropped fast. I took a deep, ragged breath of the clean air. My lungs burned, but my head began to clear. I watched the towering racks of servers in front of me. The violent vibrations slowly faded away. The deafening scream of the internal fans dropped to a steady, manageable hum. One by one, the angry red indicator lights flickered. They turned amber, then settled into a calm, pulsing blue. The heartbeat of the machine was returning. I pulled a roll of black electrical tape from my pocket. I wrapped it tightly around the makeshift jumper, securing the connection in place. I stood up slowly. My knees ached and my joints popped in the cold air. My hands were covered in black soot and fresh, angry burns. I wiped the dirt off my trousers. I turned around and looked through the thick glass door. The crowd of elite engineers and executives was frozen in place in the hallway. Marcus Vance stood at the very front. His mouth was slightly open. The panic in his eyes had been replaced by a stunned, silent disbelief. He was staring at the sea of calming blue lights. He was looking at the man in the cheap suit. The guy he had dismissed just 10 minutes ago had saved his empire with a piece of scrap metal. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, leaving a streak of grease across my brow. The immediate danger was over, but the adrenaline was still burning hot in my chest. I picked up my multi-tool and folded the blade away, slipping it back into my pocket. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped out of the server room. The heat followed me into the hallway, a lingering phantom of the disaster, but it was losing its grip. The space was dead silent. The wailing siren had cut off. The harsh amber emergency lights clicked out, replaced by the cool, steady glow of the overhead fluorescent panels. The crisis was over. A dozen men in expensive suits stared at me. The elite engineers, the visionaries, the architects of tomorrow. They parted like water as I walked toward them. I didn't stop. I headed straight for the elevator. My hands were stinging from the electrical burns, and my cheap shirt was soaked with sweat and grime. "Wait!" The voice echoed down the long corridor. It was Marcus Vance. I stopped and turned around slowly. He walked toward me. His tailored suit jacket was discarded, his crisp white collar unbuttoned, and his tie hung loose. He looked down at my blackened hands. "What did you do in there?" he asked. His voice was quiet. The arrogant edge was entirely gone. "The cooling loop shorted due to a liquid spill," I said, keeping my tone flat. "The system locked down to protect the core, but it was suffocating itself. I bypassed the charred relay and forced the external vents open." Marcus looked past my shoulder, staring at the calming blue lights pulsing safely behind the thick glass. He knew exactly what that meant. I had just saved his empire from a catastrophic data wipe. "You used a piece of jewelry," an engineer whispered, stepping forward from the crowd. He was staring at the makeshift jumper visible through the glass pane. "That's a severe protocol violation." I looked at the kid. His hands were trembling. "It's a broken piece of brass," I told him, "and it just saved your job." Marcus raised a hand, silencing the panicked engineer. He turned his attention back to me. The dissecting gaze was back, but this time it was evaluating something entirely different. "I misjudged you, David," he said. The words tasted like gravel in his mouth, but he forced them out into the open. "You don't just understand theory, you understand survival." "I understand machines," I replied. "They don't care about your pedigree. They don't care about your stock price. They only care if the physical connection is solid." I turned around to resume my walk to the elevator. There was a busted laptop waiting on my kitchen workbench, and I had wasted enough of my morning. "The senior architect position," Marcus called out. His voice carried a new weight. "It's yours, if you want it." I stopped again. I didn't turn around right away. I let the words hang in the cool, sterile air of the glass tower. It was the lifeline I needed. It was the end of the red envelopes on the table and the freezing winter nights. It was security for my son. I turned to face the CEO. "I don't do formal wear," I said, pointing to my ruined collar, "and I don't manage people. I fix the iron." Marcus offered a slow, stiff nod. "You report directly to me. You handle the physical infrastructure. You do whatever it takes to keep the heart beating." "And the salary?" I asked. I named a number. It was 20% higher than the original listing. Marcus didn't blink. "Done. HR will have the paperwork ready for your signature by tomorrow morning." This time he stepped forward and held out his hand. I looked at it. A clean, manicured hand that had never felt the bite of a live wire or the grease of a busted engine. I reached out and shook it. My grease-stained, calloused palm was rough against his smooth skin. We weren't friends, but we had a mutual understanding. The mechanic and the visionary. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt different. The crushing weight in my chest was gone. The cheap suit was ruined, smelling of smoke and sweat, but I felt lighter than I had in years. I walked across the vast expanse of white marble. The receptionist looked up from her screen this time. She didn't say a word, but her eyes tracked me all the way to the revolving doors. The street outside was still slick from the morning rain. The heavy gray clouds were breaking apart, letting thin, bright rays of sunlight hit the damp pavement. The city noise was just as loud, but it didn't feel like a threat anymore. I walked the 3 blocks to my rusted Ford. It looked out of place parked among the sleek black sedans, a battered survivor of a different era. I climbed into the cold cab and turned the key. The engine sputtered, caught, and roared to life with a deep rumble. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel for a long moment. I let out a heavy breath. I felt like I had been holding for 2 straight years. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and wet concrete. I didn't care about the broken heater. I didn't care about the potholes rattling my suspension. I pulled up to my apartment building. The red brick was chipped and the front concrete step was crooked. It wasn't a glass tower, but it was mine. I walked up the narrow stairs to the 2nd floor. I unlocked the deadbolt and pushed the door open. The familiar smell of cheap tomato soup and toasted bread filled the small hallway. Mrs. Gable was sitting at the worn kitchen table. She was helping Leo with a math worksheet. She looked up and smiled. "How did it go, David?" she asked. Her eyes fell on my blackened hands and ruined, soot-stained shirt. Her smile faltered into a look of concern. Leo dropped his yellow pencil. He ran across the linoleum floor and wrapped his small arms around my legs. "Dad," I knelt down and pulled him close. I buried my face in his shoulder. He smelled like crayons, laundry soap, and outside air. "It went fine, Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice thick with emotion I couldn't hide. "It went fine." I stood up and walked over to the kitchen counter. I gathered the towering stack of red envelopes in one hand. I dropped them into the trash can under the sink. They were just paper now. They had no power over our lives anymore. I walked to the bathroom and began scrubbing the thick grease and soot from my hands. The water turned black, spiraling down the rusty drain. I watched the rough skin emerge from under the grime. The electrical burns would heal. The new scars would just fade into the old calluses. Later that night, I tucked Leo into his bed. I placed his plastic dinosaur on the nightstand next to his ear. I watched his small chest rise and fall in the dim light of the street lamp outside his window. This was the only connection that mattered. The world outside is full of broken systems. It is full of glass towers built on fragile, untested foundations. People will look at your worn clothes and your calloused hands, and they will tell you that you don't belong. They will try to lock you out of the room because you don't fit their pristine design. But a machine is just cold metal until someone gives it a heartbeat. And a life is just a struggle until you find the right wire to cross. You don't need a fancy pedigree to build something strong. You just need the grit to stand in the fire when everyone else runs away. You need the courage to look at a broken world and know that your own 2 hands can fix it. We all carry our own scars. We all have those silent moments where we felt like a spare part left behind in a fast world that only values shiny new things. If you've ever stood in the shadows while others claimed the spotlight, or if you've ever had to prove your true worth against impossible odds, I know you understand this quiet kind of victory. Leave a piece of your own story down in the comments. I read every single one because those shared experiences are the real heartbeats that keep this channel alive.